The September rain pelted against the courthouse windows like angry fists demanding justice. Inside, Sarah Washington stood in the security line for the third time, her Cartier watch marking each precious minute she was losing. At 35, she had mastered the art of patience, but today was testing her limits. "Ma'am, step through again," the white security guard drawled, his badge reading Officer Thompson. He barely glanced at the three white attorneys who rushed past, their briefcases unchecked. Sarah noticed one of them was carrying a metal water bottle, the same item that had triggered the detector when she passed through. She inhaled deeply, channeling the composure that had carried her through Harvard Law's most challenging moments. Her charcoal Armani suit was getting wrinkled from the repeated screenings, and her freshly pressed silk blouse clung uncomfortably to her skin from the rain. The morning had started with promise. She prepared meticulously for both her minor court appearance and the upcoming federal case meeting. Now she was running late for both. "Is there a problem here?" A familiar voice cut through the tension. District Attorney James Chen approached the security checkpoint, his presence commanding immediate attention. Sarah had worked with him on several cases, and his reputation in the courthouse was legendary. Officer Thompson straightened slightly. "Just following protocol, sir." "Ms. Washington is a federal prosecutor," Chen stated flatly. "I've seen her in this courthouse almost daily for the past 3 years." His eyes flickered to Sarah's briefcase, which had already been searched twice. "I believe we can proceed." The security guard's face flushed, but he maintained his stance. "Protocol is protocol, sir. One more scan." Sarah raised her hand slightly, stopping Chen's impending protest. "It's fine, James. We all want a secure courthouse." Her voice carried the weight of dignity that had become her armor over years of similar encounters. She stepped through the metal detector one final time. Silence. As she gathered her belongings, Sarah caught her reflection in the lobby's marble walls. Her dark skin contrasted sharply with the white collar of her blouse, her braids elegantly styled in a professional updo. She looked every bit the accomplished federal prosecutor she was, yet somehow, to some, she still didn't fit their image of one. The elevator ride to the 5th floor gave her a moment to center herself. She checked her phone, 3 missed calls from the U.S. Attorney's Office. The Rodriguez cartel case was heating up, and as lead prosecutor, she couldn't afford any distractions. Yet here she was, headed to municipal court for a parking ticket she'd received while delivering crucial evidence to a grand jury last month. The irony wasn't lost on her. Stepping off the elevator, Sarah navigated the familiar corridor, her heels clicking against the worn marble floor. The courthouse buzzed with its usual morning energy, a mix of anxiety, determination, and resigned acceptance. Junior attorneys clutched coffee cups like lifelines, while seasoned lawyers exchanged knowing glances over case files. Through the crowd, she spotted Marcus, her former law school classmate, now a public defender. He was exiting Judge Henderson's courtroom, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Their eyes met, and he shook his head slightly. "That bad?" Sarah asked, falling into step beside him. "You know Henderson," Marcus muttered. "My client's white, but she's poor. Might as well be invisible in his courtroom. Denied the payment plan for her fines, even with documented hardship." He glanced at his watch. "You're up next? What brings you down from the federal building?" Sarah patted her briefcase. "Parking ticket. Should be straightforward." Marcus's laugh was hollow. "Nothing straightforward in Henderson's court, especially not today. He's on a power trip this morning. Started by lecturing the entire gallery about respect for the law and personal responsibility." He squeezed her shoulder. "Watch yourself in there." As Marcus walked away, Sarah felt a familiar weight settle in her stomach. She'd heard about Judge Henderson, of course. Everyone had. His reputation for being old school was courthouse code for something far more problematic. But she'd never appeared before him, her federal cases keeping her in different circles. Outside courtroom 5B, Sarah checked her phone one last time. Another missed call from the U.S. Attorney's Office, plus a text about a crucial development in the Rodriguez case. She would need to leave immediately after this hearing. The courtroom doors swung open, releasing a stream of defeated-looking defendants. Sarah straightened her suit jacket and grabbed her briefcase. As she reached for the door handle, a crack of thunder shook the building, and the fluorescent lights flickered momentarily. Perfect timing, she murmured to herself, pushing open the heavy wooden door. The air inside was thick with tension, and all eyes turned to watch her enter. At the bench, Judge Henderson sat like a king on his throne, his reading glasses perched precariously on his nose as he scowled at the docket before him. Sarah took her place in the gallery, knowing that sometimes the biggest battles for justice started in the smallest of courtrooms. The storm outside grew stronger, but it was nothing compared to the tempest brewing within these walls. Judge Robert Henderson's courtroom operated like a well-oiled machine, efficient, cold, and utterly merciless. Sarah sat in the third row, observing the proceedings with growing concern. The judge had already dismissed 5 cases in under 15 minutes, barely letting anyone speak beyond stating their name. A young mother with 2 small children stepped forward, attempting to explain why she couldn't pay her traffic fine in full. Judge Henderson cut her off mid-sentence. "The court doesn't run a charity, Mrs. Peters. Either pay the fine or face the consequences." The woman's shoulders slumped as she gathered her children, tears welling in her eyes. Sarah's phone vibrated silently, another message about the Rodriguez case. She glanced down quickly. Witness willing to testify. Time sensitive. Her jaw tightened. She needed to wrap this up quickly, but Henderson's courtroom was becoming a masterclass in judicial indifference. "Next case." Henderson's voice boomed through the courtroom. "Washington, Sarah. Parking violation on Federal Plaza." Sarah rose gracefully, her heels echoing in the now hushed courtroom. As she approached the podium, she noticed Henderson didn't look up from his papers. Instead, he continued writing, his left hand gripping his pen with unnecessary force. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice clear and measured, "I'm here regarding citation number P47,892. I have documentation showing that at the time this ticket was issued, I was delivering crucial evidence to a federal grand jury." "Ms. Washington," Henderson interrupted, still not looking up, "are you suggesting that federal employees are exempt from parking regulations?" His tone dripped with sarcasm. "No, Your Honor," Sarah replied evenly. "I'm explaining that there was designated parking for federal officers conducting official business, which is where I was parked. I have photographs and written confirmation from." "Ms. Washington," Henderson cut in again, finally looking up. His pale blue eyes narrowed as they met hers, and something flickered across his face, surprise, perhaps, or something else entirely. "This court sees dozens of people every day who think their business is too important for parking laws." The gallery had grown unusually quiet. Even the court clerk had stopped shuffling papers, sensing the mounting tension. Through the tall windows, the storm continued its assault, punctuating the judge's words with distant thunder. Sarah reached into her briefcase, retrieving a carefully prepared folder. "Your Honor, if you'll permit me to present my evidence." "Evidence?" Henderson's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "For a parking ticket. Perhaps you're confused about which court you're in, Ms. Washington. This isn't some drawn-out federal proceeding where we waste taxpayer dollars on endless deliberations." A few snickers emerged from the gallery, quickly silenced by Sarah's quiet dignity as she stood her ground. She was painfully aware of every eye in the courtroom, of the weight of this moment, extending far beyond a simple parking ticket. "Your Honor," she tried once more, "with all due respect, the law provides specific exemptions for federal officers conducting." Henderson's gavel crashed down, the sound reverberating through the courtroom like a gunshot. "I don't need a lecture on the law from you, Ms. Washington. The citation clearly states you were parked in a no-standing zone for over an hour. The fine is $200 plus court costs." Sarah's phone buzzed again in her pocket, the third time in 5 minutes. The Rodriguez case couldn't wait, but neither could this injustice. She thought of the young mother who'd just left in tears, of Marcus's defeated client, of every person who'd stood where she stood and been dismissed without a fair hearing. "Your Honor," she said, her voice taking on the steel that had won her numerous federal cases. "I must respectfully insist on entering these documents into the record. The law requires. The law requires that you show proper respect for this court." Henderson's face had flushed red. "One more word, Ms. Washington, and you'll be in contempt. Your attitude demonstrates precisely the kind of disregard for authority that brings people into this courtroom in the first place." The racial undertone in his comment hung in the air like smoke. A few attorneys in the gallery exchanged glances, and one began taking notes. Sarah stood perfectly still, her expression unchanging, though her heart hammered against her ribs. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence. Outside, the storm had intensified, casting dramatic shadows through the rain-streaked windows. Sarah's phone vibrated once more in her pocket, and she knew without checking that it was the U.S. Attorney's Office, growing increasingly urgent. Judge Henderson had already turned his attention back to his docket, clearly considering the matter closed. "Pay the fine within 48 hours, Ms. Washington, or a warrant will be issued. Next case." But Sarah didn't move. Instead, she calmly reached for her phone just as it began to ring, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony filling the courtroom with its dramatic notes. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and with it, a shift in the power dynamic that would shake the very foundations of Henderson's carefully constructed kingdom. The ringtone sliced through the tension like a knife. Judge Henderson's head snapped up, his face contorting with barely contained rage. "Who dares tow?" "My apologies, Your Honor," Sarah interrupted smoothly, holding up her still-ringing phone. The screen displayed U.S. Attorney Major Crimes Division. "I need to take this call regarding the Rodriguez cartel case. As I mentioned, I'm due in federal court this morning." A ripple of whispers swept through the gallery. The Rodriguez case had been splashed across every newspaper's front page for weeks, the biggest drug trafficking bust in the state's history. Even the court clerk stopped pretending to shuffle papers, her eyes darting between Sarah and the judge. Henderson's complexion shifted from red to ashen as recognition dawned. "The Rodriguez case?" he repeated, his voice notably less certain. "Yes, Your Honor." Sarah's voice remained steady, professional. "As lead federal prosecutor, I'm coordinating with DEA agents this morning regarding a key witness." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "Which is precisely why I was parked in the federal officer's designated area when this citation was issued." The courtroom had grown so quiet you could hear the rain drumming against the windows. In the gallery, several attorneys had pulled out their phones, fingers flying across screens as they documented the unfolding scene. One whispered, "That's Sarah Washington. She's the one who cracked the cartel's encryption." Henderson's hands trembled slightly as he reached for Sarah's documentation, the same papers he dismissed moments ago. His reading glasses shook as he put them on, suddenly very interested in the evidence he refused to consider. "I see here," he cleared his throat, "that you have authorization from Chief Federal Judge Martinez." The name dropped from his lips like a lid weight. Judge Martinez was known for her zero-tolerance policy toward judicial misconduct. "Correct," Sarah replied, finally silencing her phone. Along with supporting documentation from the U.S. Attorney's Office and the DEA task force. She maintained eye contact with Henderson, her expression professional but unyielding. "I believe you'll find everything in order, Your Honor." The rain outside intensified, matching the storm of emotions playing across Henderson's face. He was trapped in a cage of his own making, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. His earlier condescension hung in the air like a bad smell, his dismissive remarks about "you people" echoing back at him with damning clarity. "Well," he fumbled, shuffling papers unnecessarily, in light of this additional information. "Your Honor," Sarah interjected carefully, "given the time-sensitive nature of my federal duties, might we expedite this matter? The documentation clearly shows I was parked legally while executing official federal business." A young public defender in the gallery barely suppressed a smile. The same judge who moments ago had been lecturing about respect for authority was now confronted with authority he couldn't dismiss, authority wielded by the very person he tried to humiliate. Henderson's gavel lay silent on its sound block, no longer a weapon of intimidation, but a symbol of his compromised position. Yes, well, he cleared his throat again. Case dismissed, Ms. Washington. You may go. But Sarah wasn't finished. With the same quiet dignity that had carried her through Harvard law and countless federal cases, she spoke once more. Your Honor, I request that this dismissal be entered into the record with a notation regarding the legal parking exemption for federal officers. It might help prevent similar misunderstandings in the future. The request was reasonable, professional, and damning in its implications. Henderson had no choice but to comply, aware that every eye in the courtroom was fixed on him, every ear attuned to his response. So ordered, he managed, scrawling on the docket sheet with significantly less flourish than before. The court clerk hurried to make the notation, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Sarah had gathered her belongings, her movements unhurried despite the urgent federal case awaiting her attention. As she turned to leave, she noticed Marcus had slipped back into the courtroom and was watching from the back row, a look of fierce pride on his face. The next defendant was already approaching the podium when Sarah reached the courtroom doors. She paused, glancing back just long enough to see Judge Henderson handling the new case with notably more patience and attention to detail. Outside in the corridor, her phone buzzed again. The Rodriguez case wouldn't wait, but she allowed herself a moment to breathe, to let the magnitude of what had just transpired settle around her. A group of young law clerks huddled nearby, whispering and shooting admiring glances in her direction. Thunder rolled outside, but the storm inside had shifted. In less than an hour, the story would begin spreading through the courthouse's marble halls, carried on the wings of texts and tweets, a reminder that justice sometimes arrives in unexpected ways. Sarah straightened her suit jacket and headed for the elevator. She had a cartel to prosecute, and this minor detour had already taken enough of her morning. Behind her, the doors to courtroom 5B closed on a judge whose world had just been irrevocably shaken. By noon, the storm had passed, but a different kind of tempest was brewing in the federal courthouse across town. Sarah sat in her corner office, surrounded by case files from the Rodriguez investigation, when her assistant Michael burst in without knocking, something he'd never done in 3 years of working together. Sarah, you need to see this, he said, holding up his phone. #Judge Henderson is trending. Someone recorded the whole thing. Sarah's hand paused over a witness statement. Recorded what? Your confrontation this morning. It's everywhere. Twitter, LinkedIn, even local news is picking it up. Michael's fingers flew across his phone screen. The video starts right when he made that comment about you people and goes through the moment he realized who you were. 3 million views and counting. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, remembering the weight of that moment. She hadn't noticed anyone recording, though she should have expected it. Nothing stayed private in courtrooms anymore, not even justice being served. Her office phone lit up, the 5th call from a news outlet in the past hour. She'd been too focused on the Rodriguez case to notice the growing media storm. On her computer screen, emails piled up. Messages of support from other federal prosecutors, interview requests, and even a note from Judge Martinez herself. The timing couldn't be worse, Sarah muttered, turning back to the case files. In less than 24 hours, she would be presenting evidence that could dismantle one of the largest drug operations on the East Coast. The last thing she needed was this kind of attention. A knock on her doorframe drew her attention. U.S. Attorney David Reynolds stood there, his usual composed demeanor tinged with concern. Got minutes, Sarah. Michael quietly excused himself as Reynolds entered, closing the door behind him. The office fell silent except for the gentle hum of Sarah's computer. I assume you've seen the video, Reynolds began, settling into one of the chairs facing her desk. Just heard about it, Sarah replied, already anticipating where this conversation was heading. Dave, I promise this won't affect the Rodriguez case. I'm fully prepared for tomorrow's. Reynolds held up a hand. This isn't about Rodriguez. Well, not entirely. He leaned forward, his expression serious. The Judicial Conduct Committee called. They're launching an investigation into Henderson's pattern of behavior. Apparently, Your incident this morning opened the floodgates. They've received dozens of complaints in the past few hours alone. Sarah's phone buzzed again. A text from Marcus. You're my hero. Half the public defenders in the city are filing complaints about Henderson now. This could change everything. Reynolds watched her process this information. Sarah, you've handled this with incredible professionalism, but I need to know. Do you want to file a formal complaint? The committee is particularly interested in your perspective, given your position. Through her office window, Sarah could see the city stretching out below, its streets and buildings bathed in post-storm sunlight. Somewhere out there, Judge Henderson was probably watching his career implode in real time, all because he couldn't see past his own prejudices. With all due respect, sir, Sarah began carefully, I believe my time is better spent prosecuting the Rodriguez cartel than pursuing personal grievances. The video speaks for itself. Reynolds nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I thought you might say that. But Sarah. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Sometimes the biggest impact we have isn't in the cases we try, but in the moments we never planned for. Her computer chimed with a new email, the Bar Association requesting her participation in a panel on judicial reform. Behind it, she could see her case notes for tomorrow's hearing, the culmination of months of work. The Rodriguez case first, she said firmly. After that, we'll see. Reynolds stood, straightening his tie. Fair enough. But heads up, the press is camped out in the lobby. Want me to send someone to get you coffee? Sarah smiled, her first genuine smile since the morning's confrontation. I appreciate it, but I think I can handle a few reporters. They can't be worse than a cartel's legal team. After Reynolds left, Sarah turned to the wall where her Harvard Law diploma hung beside a photo of her grandmother, who'd cleaned courthouses like Henderson's for 30 years. Look at us now, Grandma, she whispered. Her phone buzzed one final time. A message from an unknown number. Ms. Washington, this is Robert Henderson. I believe we need to talk. Sarah stared at the message for a long moment, then set her phone aside. She had a case to win first. Henderson, and everything his message represented, would have to wait. Outside her office, she could hear the bustle of the federal building, the steady rhythm of justice continuing its march forward. The morning storm had cleared, but its impact would be felt long after the skies had cleared. Sometimes, she reflected, the most important victories came not from the cases you chose to fight, but from the moments when justice found you instead. The next morning dawned with Judge Henderson's face plastered across every local news channel. He sat alone in his chambers, blinds drawn against the media crews camped outside the courthouse. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since yesterday, but he'd stopped answering after the third call from the Judicial Conduct Committee. On his desk, the morning's newspaper screamed headlines he couldn't bear to read fully. Federal prosecutor exposes judicial bias. Judge's conduct under investigation. And worst of all, pattern of prejudice. More victims come forward. His own words from the viral video haunted him. You people. How many times had he used that phrase without thinking? A soft knock interrupted his brooding. Come in, he called out, expecting another reporter who'd somehow slipped past security. Instead, his daughter Catherine entered, still wearing her prosecutor's badge from the state attorney's office. Dad, she said, her voice carrying a weight he'd never heard before. We need to talk. Henderson gestured to the chair across from his desk, the same chair where he lectured countless attorneys about respect for the law. Catherine remained standing. I saw the video, she continued, her words careful but cutting. Actually, everyone in my office saw it. Do you know what it's like to hear your colleagues discussing your father's racial bias over morning coffee? Katie, you don't understand. He began, but she cut him off. No, Dad, I understand perfectly. I've understood for years, but I always made excuses. He's from a different generation, I'd tell myself. He doesn't mean it that way. She pulled out her phone, pulling up a spreadsheet. But after yesterday, I did some research. Did you know your sentencing rates show a clear racial disparity, or that minority attorneys are 3 times more likely to be held in contempt in your courtroom? Henderson felt the blood drain from his face. In 20 years on the bench, He'd never looked at his own records that way. He prided himself on being tough but fair, on treating everyone exactly the same. The numbers don't lie, Dad, Catherine continued, her voice breaking slightly. And now I'm questioning every dinner conversation we've ever had, every offhand comment, every joke I laughed at because it was easier than confronting the truth. Through his chamber windows, Henderson could see the media vans still parked outside. Somewhere in the federal courthouse across town, Sarah Washington was probably preparing for her big case, unaware of the soul-searching she triggered in this very room. I spoke to Mom last night, Catherine added, finally sinking into the chair. She's devastated, not because of the media attention, but because she watched that video and saw exactly who you've become, who you've maybe always been. Henderson's hands trembled as he reached for his reading glasses, the same ones he used yesterday to finally read Sarah Washington's documentation. What am I supposed to do? He whispered, more to himself than his daughter. You start by listening, Catherine replied firmly. Really listening, maybe for the first time in your career. To the complaints being filed, to the stories coming out, to the people you've hurt. She stood up, straightening her blazer in a gesture that painfully reminded him of her mother. And then you do better. Not because you got caught, but because it's right. As she reached the door, she paused. The Judicial Conduct Committee is meeting tomorrow. They're expecting your response to the allegations. I'd suggest you think very carefully about what you want your legacy to be. After Catherine left, Henderson turned to his computer. His email inbox overflowed with messages from colleagues, many expressing support in ways that only highlighted the problem. These people are just looking for attention, one fellow judge had written. Don't let them bully you. But as he clicked through his case records, patterns emerged that he couldn't unsee. How many Sarah Washingtons had stood before him, their qualifications and dignity dismissed before they could even speak? How many lives had his unexamined biases affected? His phone buzzed with another message, the chief judge requesting his immediate presence. Outside, a news helicopter circled the courthouse, its distant chopping a reminder that this story wouldn't simply blow over. Henderson reached for his robes, then stopped. For the first time in 20 years, he felt unworthy of wearing them. Instead, he straightened his tie and stood up, catching his reflection in the window. The man staring back at him looked older, smaller somehow, stripped of the authority he wielded so carelessly for so long. Time to face the music, he muttered, reaching for his chamber door. The hallway beyond buzzed with activity, every head turning as he emerged. He could feel the weight of their stares, hear the whispers following him down the corridor. Sometimes, he realized, it took losing everything you thought you were to discover who you could become. The walk to the chief judge's office had never felt longer or more necessary. The Rodriguez cartel case dominated headlines by week's end, but it wasn't Sarah Washington's masterful prosecution that caught the media's attention. Instead, a different sort of justice had captured the public imagination. Hashtag Judge Henderson had evolved into hashtag Justice for All, spawning a nationwide conversation about bias in the judicial system. Sarah sat in her office, staring at the wall of monitors tracking the case's coverage. CNN displayed footage of protesters outside the municipal courthouse, their signs demanding judicial reform. MSNBC featured a panel of legal experts discussing implicit bias in the justice system. Even Fox News had picked up the story, though their angle focused more on judicial activism and social media mobs. Your 9 o'clock is here, Michael announced from the doorway. Should I tell the Times reporter to wait? No need, Sarah replied, closing her laptop. I'm not doing interviews. She'd maintained this position despite increasing pressure from both media and advocacy groups. The Rodriguez case had concluded successfully yesterday, a unanimous guilty verdict that would dismantle one of the largest drug operations on the East Coast. Yet here she was, still fielding calls about a parking ticket. The door opened again, revealing Marcus Johnson, now sporting a newly minted position with the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department. You're trembling again, he said by way of greeting, settling into a chair. Someone leaked Henderson's internal review numbers. It's not pretty. Sarah had seen the statistics, 20 years of documented disparities in sentencing, contempt charges, and bail decisions. The pattern was impossible to ignore once you started looking. "How's the task force coming along?" she asked, changing the subject. Marcus grinned. 12 jurisdictions have already signed on for the judicial review program. Turns out, a lot of courts were just waiting for an excuse to examine their practices. Your little parking ticket turned into quite the catalyst. "It wasn't my parking ticket that did this," Sarah corrected him. "Henderson did this to himself. I just happened to be the one holding the mirror." Her phone buzzed. Another message from Judge Henderson. He'd been trying to reach her for days, each message more carefully worded than the last. She hadn't responded yet, unsure if any response could bridge the chasm his actions had created. A commotion outside drew their attention. Through her office windows, they could see a crowd gathering in the courthouse plaza. Signs rose above the heads of the assembled. "Justice knows no color," "Reform our courts," and most pointedly, "No more Hendersons." "You should say something," Marcus suggested quietly. "People are looking for leadership on this." Sarah shook her head. "I'm a prosecutor, not an activist. My job is to uphold the law, not become a symbol." "Sometimes we don't get to choose what we become," Marcus countered. "Sometimes the moment chooses us." Their conversation was interrupted by a news alert flashing across the office monitors. Judge Henderson had just announced his temporary recusal from the bench pending a full investigation. The footage showed him leaving the courthouse, looking significantly older than he had a week ago. Catherine walked beside him, her face a mask of professional composure. "Word is he's enrolled in an intensive bias training program," Marcus commented, "voluntarily, before the committee could mandate it." Sarah's phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Judge Martinez. "Need your input on the new judicial training guidelines. Your experience could help prevent future incidents." The irony wasn't lost on her. A simple parking ticket had exposed fault lines running deep through the justice system, creating tremors that continued to spread. Her grandmother's photo seemed to watch her from the wall, silent witness to changes she could never have imagined while cleaning those same courthouses decades ago. "Fine," Sarah said finally, turning to Marcus. "Set up a meeting with the task force. But make it clear, I'm there as a prosecutor sharing observations, not as the face of a movement." Marcus smiled knowingly. "Of course, though you might want to tell that to them." He gestured toward the plaza, where the crowd had grown larger. Among them, Sarah recognized faces from Henderson's courtroom. The young mother with her children, public defenders, court staff, citizens whose stories might never have been heard if not for one moment of exposed truth. Her computer chimed with another email, the Bar Association announcing the Special Committee on Judicial Reform. The sender had highlighted a particular passage. "Recent events have demonstrated the urgent need for systematic change." Sarah stood at her window, watching the gathering below. The morning sun caught their signs, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. In that moment, she understood that sometimes justice arrived not in dramatic courtroom victories, but in small moments of truth that refused to be silenced. Her phone buzzed one final time. Judge Henderson's latest message simply read, "I'm ready to listen." Taking a deep breath, Sarah began to type her response. Some conversations, she realized, were too important to postpone, no matter how difficult they might be. The conference room of the Judicial Conduct Committee sat 20 stories above the city, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of both courthouses. Judge Robert Henderson stood before the panel of his peers, his prepared statement trembling slightly in his hands. The room was packed. This hearing had drawn unprecedented attention. "Before I begin," Henderson said, his voice catching, "I'd like to acknowledge someone in the audience." He turned to face Sarah Washington, who sat quietly in the back row. She hadn't planned to attend, but his last message had been different from the others. "I need to own my actions publicly. Your presence would remind me why this matters." "Ms. Washington," he continued, "your parking ticket never should have reached this room. Not because you're a federal prosecutor, but because I should have listened. Really listened. To you, and to countless others who stood before me over the years." The committee members exchanged glances. This wasn't the defiant defense they'd expected from a judge known for his rigid authority. In the front row, Catherine Henderson watched her father intently, her hand clasped with her mother's. "I've spent the past month reviewing every case I've presided over," Henderson said, placing his statement aside. 20 years of decisions, analyzed for patterns I never wanted to see. The numbers don't lie. My bias, whether conscious or unconscious, affected real lives, real families, real justice. He turned to the window, gathering himself. Below, protesters still gathered daily, their signs visible even from this height. I've attended bias training, yes. I've read the studies, reviewed the statistics, completed the workshops. But more importantly, I've started listening to the stories. His voice grew stronger. I've heard from attorneys who changed their names on court documents to sound less ethnic. From defendants who received harsher sentences than their white counterparts for identical crimes. From court staff who witnessed my behavior but felt powerless to speak up. Sarah noticed Catherine wiping away tears, her professional composure cracking. Next to her, Mrs. Henderson sat straight-backed, pride and pain warring on her face. The easy path would be to resign, Henderson continued. To walk away and let this become another cautionary tale. That would be one final act of privilege, choosing my own comfort over the hard work of change. He reached for a thick binder on the table. Instead, I'm presenting this to the committee. It's a comprehensive review of my cases, highlighting disparities in my rulings. I'm requesting that each affected case be reviewed by an independent panel. Where bias is found, I want the rulings vacated and the cases reheard by other judges. A murmur ran through the room. Such an admission could open the door to hundreds of appeals, potentially overturning years of decisions. The committee chairman leaned forward, brow furrowed. Furthermore, Henderson pressed on, I'm volunteering to work with the newly formed Judicial Reform Task Force, not as a judge, but as an example of how bias can corrupt even those sworn to protect justice. My story, my failure, should be part of mandatory training for every judge in this state. Sarah felt a shift in the room's energy. This wasn't a man trying to save his career. This was someone confronting his own fallibility in the most public way possible. I don't expect forgiveness, Henderson said, his eyes meeting Sarah's briefly. I don't even expect understanding. What I'm asking for is the chance to be part of the solution, to help ensure that no other judge becomes what I was, and no other citizen faces what Ms. Washington, and so many others, faced in my courtroom. The silence that followed was heavy with possibility. Outside, the sun emerged from behind clouds, illuminating the protest signs below. One caught Sarah's eye, "Justice learns too." The committee chairman cleared his throat. Judge Henderson, are you aware that implementing these recommendations could effectively end your judicial career? Yes, Henderson replied simply. But maybe that's not the legacy I'm meant to leave. Maybe my contribution to justice will be showing others what it looks like to acknowledge bias, to take responsibility, and to work toward genuine change. Catherine stood suddenly, moving to stand beside her father. The state attorney's office supports this proposal, she declared, her voice steady despite her tears. We're prepared to assist with the case reviews and any necessary rehearings. One by one, others stood, public defenders, court administrators, civil rights attorneys. Sarah remained seated, watching the scene unfold. Her parking ticket had become a pebble that started an avalanche, but the real change would come from what people chose to do in its wake. The chairman called for a brief recess. As the room buzzed with discussion, Judge Henderson made his way to where Sarah sat. He opened his mouth to speak, but she held up a hand. Save it for the real work ahead, she said quietly. This is just the beginning. Henderson nodded, understanding. Sometimes, the hardest judgments were the ones we passed on ourselves. 1 year later, the National Judicial Conference's main hall was filled to capacity. Judges, attorneys, and legal scholars from across the country had gathered for what had become the most anticipated session, Confronting Bias, a blueprint for change. Sarah Washington adjusted her microphone, scanning the sea of faces before her. In the front row, Robert Henderson sat next to his daughter Catherine, both now integral members of the Judicial Reform Task Force. Behind them, familiar faces from that fateful morning in courtroom 5B. The young mother, the public defenders, the court staff, all now part of a citizen advisory board for judicial accountability. When I walked into court that morning, Sarah began, I was thinking about a parking ticket and a cartel prosecution. I wasn't planning to spark a revolution in judicial accountability. A knowing chuckle rippled through the audience. She gestured to the screen behind her, where statistics told a compelling story. In the year since the incident, 27 states had adopted mandatory bias training for judges. 15 jurisdictions had implemented anonymous reporting systems for court bias, and in Henderson's former courthouse, a pioneering program allowed community members to review judicial conduct patterns. But the real story isn't in these numbers, Sarah continued. It's in the changes we can't quantify. It's in the young attorney who no longer has to anglicize her name on court documents. It's in the defendant who knows his case will be heard fairly, regardless of his appearance or accent. From her seat in the audience, Judge Martinez nodded approvingly. Her court had become a model for implementing the reforms, proving that change was possible without compromising judicial authority. Some called it a social media phenomenon, Sarah acknowledged, pulling up the familiar video that had started it all. They said we were destroying judicial independence, but what we've actually done is strengthen it by making it more accountable, more transparent, and more just. She turned to where Henderson sat. Judge Henderson's journey hasn't been easy. The review of his cases revealed patterns of bias that affected hundreds of lives. But his response to that revelation has become a template for institutional accountability. Henderson straightened in his chair as Sarah described the program he'd developed, a comprehensive approach to identifying and addressing judicial bias that was now being adopted nationwide. His own story had become a case study in how privilege, when confronted honestly, could be transformed into a tool for change. The parking ticket was dismissed, Sarah said, drawing another laugh from the crowd. But something more important was delivered that day, a wake-up call that justice isn't just about laws and procedures. It's about the human beings who implement them and their willingness to confront their own biases. She clicked to the next slide, showing the protest signs that had become symbols of the movement. These weren't just protesters, she explained. They were citizens demanding that their justice system live up to its promises. And for perhaps the first time, the system listened. Catherine Henderson stood up, joining Sarah at the podium. As the new head of the state's Judicial Oversight Committee, she embodied the next generation of legal leadership. My father taught me something valuable this year, Catherine addressed the crowd. He showed me that true justice requires constant self-examination, that no one, no matter their position or power, is beyond the need for growth. Sarah watched as Robert Henderson dabbed at his eyes, no longer the imperious judge who had dismissed her so casually a year ago. His transformation had cost him his position on the bench, but had gained him something more valuable, the respect of a community he had once alienated. The work isn't finished, Sarah concluded, displaying a map of jurisdictions still resistant to reform. But we've proven that change is possible. That accountability isn't the enemy of justice, it's its strongest ally. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just for her speech. It was for every person who had ever stood before a judge feeling powerless, every attorney who had swallowed their dignity to protect their clients, every court worker who had witnessed injustice but feared speaking up. As the applause died down, Sarah noticed a young black law student approaching the podium, clutching a legal pad. Ms. Washington, she began hesitantly, I'm interning at the municipal court this summer. How do I make a difference? Sarah finished for her. The girl nodded. Sarah glanced at Henderson, then back at the student. Start with the small things, she advised. A parking ticket, a minor violation, a seemingly insignificant moment. That's where change begins. And never forget, justice isn't just a concept in law books. It's alive in every interaction, every decision, every moment we choose to stand up and say, this matters. Outside the conference hall, The city hummed with activity. In courtrooms across the country, judges were beginning their days with a new awareness. And somewhere, in another courthouse, another moment of truth was waiting to spark its own revolution. The parking ticket that had started it all hung framed in Sarah's office now, a reminder that justice, like change, often arrived in unexpected packages.